When Pastor Tony asked us to give our testimony, I had to take pause because I've always felt I don't have much of a testimony. Much of that may be fear. God often calls us to do things we're afraid of, and it's important to know that He'll always make a way. It's important for us to realize the value of our testimonies. Not only do our testimonies represent us coming to Christ, but they can also contribute to bringing others to Him when we share. Every story of conversion is a dramatic telling of God's kindness and grace. Some may not make the cut for a Hollywood production like ours, at least I feel, but that doesn't change the necessity to tell those stories. All throughout Scripture, we find testimonies declaring the greatness of the God we serve. Apostle Paul, being an enemy of Christians, to how God used Timothy's faithful mother and grandmother to lead him to Christ in 2 Timothy. To the man who hung on the cross beside Jesus, we only knew him as a thief, but Jesus knew him differently. All stories are of grace. One grace may overcome, the other may encourage. But in the end, it's grace that all of those men served and entered into God's kingdom. I grew up in this area my entire life. Earliest memories go back to me growing up in Linwood Garden Apartments in Cheltenham. But around the age of 3, my parents got a divorce, and my mom, my younger sister, and I moved back to my grandparents' house in Plymouth Meeting. By the time we were school-aged, we had our own apartment in Plymouth Meeting. We had an ordinary life, to me at least. My mom was a single mom raising 2 young kids. She worked 2 jobs to support us. So that meant we spent a lot of times raising ourselves. And I don't mean any disrespect when I say that. A lot of times that's how it was back then. I can occasionally remember having a babysitter, but for the most part, we were very independent. First and second grade, I was a walker. I walked to and from school each day. And I was joking with Karah, we can barely get our 5-year-old daughter now to put her shoes on the right foot. So it's like, a lot has changed, but my mom was strict. I had a schedule. When I got home, I must do my homework first, then my chores, and then I could do what I wanted to do, play outside, video games, watch TV. If it was a night my mom worked late, she told us what time to go to bed, and I would make sure my sister and I were in bed. Part of that schedule was going to my dad's house every other weekend. It was just ordinary to us. This was our life. Well, we knew we weren't the richest kids, but we had both parents and step-parents in our lives, and we had a safe place to lay down to bed each night. My mom worked hard to give us everything we asked for: vacations to the beach, presents under the tree, new shoes and clothes each year, always food in the house. I seemed to always be content, happy with what I had. I can say that I was given much freedom as a child, and it would have been very easy for my life to take a different path if I were to abuse that freedom, or if that freedom was to abuse me. I can't sit here and say that I had the willpower or even the understanding to make the choices I made as a 9, 10-year-old kid and how they'd impact me as I grew up. And I didn't understand contentment, nor would I consider it was something I was striving for. But looking back, I can definitely say that God has always had a hand of protection over me, and I would consider my attitude of contentment to be a gift from God. My early teens, I started going to youth group at my grandmom's church in Norristown. This was really my first introduction to Christianity. My mom had grown up in the church, so I can't say I knew nothing of the Bible, but this is when I can actively remember learning about Christ. And it was just a fun time. I look forward to going every Wednesday night. We went to camp 3 or 4 times a year around the school holidays and for 1 full week in the summer. Later, our youth group moved to Spring City, PA, all the way up 422, and it took us about an hour to get there, but our youth leaders were dedicated, and every Wednesday they would drive us up there and drive us back. But it was around this time that things started to change. I started noticing change around me. We were going into high school, my friends were changing, getting into trouble, girls, drugs, you name it. Don't get me wrong, I wasn't a perfect kid. I loved a good prank, but I never got into any real trouble. I never got into any real trouble. I knew the guys who had drugs, but I never once did any, not even one cigarette. I was too much of a homebody to have any real relationships with girls, but cool enough to be voted homecoming king and graduate top of my class. I knew where all of the parties were and sometimes got invites, but I literally had no desire to attend. I can't honestly say why I took the path I did, and to a certain point that it was even intentional. But again, looking back, I just have to thank God for my attitude of contentment and for preserving me for my most important relationship yet to come.
That relationship was me. Spoiler alert. As Barry said, my story and his story are not exactly Hollywood material. My testimony is not one of strife or heartache or sadness, really. I grew up in a Christian home with two married parents who are still happily married today. Really demonstrated a loving, God-filled marriage for me and my siblings. I've gone to church faithfully since I was a week old. My dad became the pastor of our church when I was 7, and he still is a pastor there today. My dad's father, my grandfather, was a pastor, and his father, my great-grandfather, was also a pastor, as well as a missionary to Albania. So we have a rich Christian history in my family. I grew up with daily family devotions, Sunday morning and evening church services, Wednesday night prayer meetings, Awanas, sword drills, and a myriad of other church functions in between. The church was my second home in a lot of ways, as I'm sure the pastor's kids can relate. We didn't have a lot of money, as my dad was a pastor, but we never once wondered if our needs would be taken care of. I attended a private Christian school for elementary and middle school, and then I attended Wissahick in high school, which is, I would say, a well-funded public high school. I never experienced abuse. I was told I was loved on a daily basis. I never experienced any significant health issues, physically or mentally. I also never experienced heartache, as Barry was my first and last boyfriend. We met at youth group summer camp in the summer of 2004 when I was 15 years old. We started dating shortly after, continued dating through high school and college, and we got married in 2010, right after Barry graduated college and right before I would graduate. I attended, what's now Cairn University. It was Philadelphia Biblical University. I graduated from there with a bachelor's degree in social work and a bachelor's degree in biblical studies. I started working as a social worker at an institutional level group home for Philadelphia kids. It was actually located in Ambler. But I was a case manager for them, took them to court, really got to know the system well through that and build relationships. During this time, we had Karah in 2014, and then in 2017, right after my job had actually shut down, we had Jordan. I had healthy pregnancies with both girls as well as baby Barry. I'm sure you guys have seen him running around. All three of our kids have been healthy. I've never experienced a miscarriage or depression or a loss of child. So, at this point, it's fairly obvious that my life has not been difficult, as I stated at the beginning, and I do thank God for that blessing every day. I've witnessed family and friends experience a lot of heartache, especially over the last 5 years, I would say, with loss of parents, siblings, health scares, infertility, miscarriages, divorce, abuse, depression, and I'm sure you guys could name a ton of other things. I've never experienced a crisis of faith moment. I know that there's this thing that pastors' kids sometimes, go through that really rebellious stage and leave, and I never, at least I don't think I've ever hit that stage. I never doubted God's love for me. I knew that I had worth as I was made in the image of God. I read my devotions daily, as was demonstrated for me by my parents. I grew up in a church with people who loved me and poured into me scripture and biblical teaching. So it's weird to say, but the more good things that God gave me, the more I feared what was to come. Throughout the New Testament, Paul, Peter, and James all talk about trials, and I was constantly wondering why I was not experiencing them. I remember first verbalizing this a few years ago, because my life was so good, I was waiting for the other shoe to drop. I was waiting for a trial.
I can also concur that growing up, I seemed to be waiting at times for my trials and tribulations that we seem to talk a lot about in youth group. Since I started dating Karah, it was the first time that I really started to attend church regularly on Sundays. Like Karah mentioned, I quickly became part of her church, and we had people pouring into us our relationship, both with each other and God. A couple of years into dating, we were about to graduate high school and get ready for college. I would be the first person in my family to attend college, and I was excited for this next chapter, had been for a while. College has always been a part of my plans, and before meeting Karah, I had dreamt of going across the country to college. No reason in particular, just kind of wanted to get away and get out of, what I've been used to for so long. But being in a committed relationship, that quickly changed. All of the schools I applied to were in Pennsylvania. A married couple in our church had both attended and met at Grove City College. It seemed to pique my interest. A highly ranked, nationally recognized Christian liberal arts college. It was affordable. Oh yeah, and it was a college grounded in conservative values. Top 10 of the most conservative colleges and universities in the country. But at the time, I didn't even know what that word truly meant. You see, growing up, we never spoke about politics, not because of conflict. We were all on the same page, but rather we simply just didn't participate, at least to my knowledge. My grandmom was 100% Italian, born to the Italian immigrants from an arranged marriage. She married a black man around 1965, only a year or two before interracial marriages became fully legal in the United States, which is today. Today is Loving Day, June 12th, when it was federally, every state across the United States made interracial marriages legal, I guess, not illegal. So happy Loving Day. But we're a beautiful biracial family. We have white people with black people, and we have biracial people. I recognized my race early on as being different, but I always considered myself to have the best of both worlds, being able to relate and blend in with both white and black people. So when one of my high school teachers stared blankly at me when I told him I was attending Grove City College in the fall, I didn't know what to make of it. And I can vividly remember standing in the classroom. He said, that's a super conservative school, with a very inquisitive look on his face. And I can honestly remember shrugging my shoulders and being like, so what? My first few weeks on campus, I realized I was far away from home, in a world so foreign to me. I even questioned my physical geographical location at times, being surrounded by more Confederate flags than minorities. I've never seen, up to that point, I don't think I've ever seen a Confederate flag. At least didn't really know what it meant. I quickly felt I had taken my surroundings and comfortableness at home for granted. I met peers whose only interaction with black people was through MTV, and were surprised to meet a black person on equal footing as them academically. I was told I didn't matter even before Black Lives Matter was a thing. And I found myself defending the historical significance of an election of the country's first black president to people who simply, and I quote, didn't want a black president. I sat through chapel sessions and classes waiting for the acknowledgement of Black History Month, but the month would go by without a peep. And this was a Christian institution of higher learning. I was finally able to identify racism, and I can't say racism has never affected me in my life up until then, but this was certainly the most blatant it has ever been, and it was clearly evident, and I remember feeling as if some were so proud and wore it as a badge of honor. This is when I found myself forming my political identity, or more so defending a lot of it. You could say to me, why don't you just transfer? I don't know exactly why. Everything I love was back home. But I'm stubborn. If you don't know that, I'm stubborn. And I felt that would be what they wanted me to do, and I wasn't going to give them that satisfaction, nor did I want it to appear like to friends and family that I had failed. Around the end of my junior year, I helped form the group SEED at Grove City College, Students Excited About Diversity. We discussed opportunities to increase Grove City's diversity and ways to promote inclusivity. We had a small yet determined group of students and some staff, but needless to say, it wasn't well received by everyone. But honestly, at this point in my life, my focus was more on my upcoming wedding and finding a job in my field upon graduating, especially for the fact that we graduated in the Great Recession. But I'll never forget the words the president of the college spoke to me as I walked across the graduation stage. He said, "Thanks for sticking with us." I can take that 1.5-second interaction to mean several things, but I would say that I appreciated that acknowledgement. His acknowledgement showed he understood my journey the last 4 years had been different than many of my peers. But in all sincerity, during my college year, it was a time of individual growth, where I grew socially and mentally, excelling in my studies. Physically, I was in the best shape of my life for my upcoming wedding, and spiritually, building upon the foundation of my relationship with Christ, which I would need in the real world. Now that I was back home, I was a person with a different perspective. I began taking note of the disparities back at home, particularly within my Christian circles, like in my place of employment and within our church at the time, and just my everyday experiences. I began noticing and confronting inequalities and inconsistencies with what I've been reading in my Bible and the Christians' approach, or lack thereof, to racial issues plaguing our nation. Reality hit us both hard when Karah received a handwritten letter in the mail, stenciled to hide the author's handwriting, telling her that her union brings a stench to all of us and to enjoy her trash life. The rest of the letter too explicit to share in church. It hurt me to see Karah so upset. But having spent the last 4 years of my life where I did, it really didn't surprise me.
Up until this point, right before I got the letter, we had received a little negativity towards our marriage. But that letter really, I guess, made it concrete in my brain. It was about that time that I really began to see issues of racial justice as more than just... My mom grew up in the South, so she would talk about the KKK walking past her door. I really began to understand that racial justice was more than the KKK. It was within our society at every level, and even in the church. It was about that time that I also began to see the church's failure to address these issues. My earliest memory of questioning the church and their stance on racial justice and justice in general was in 2012 with the murder of Trayvon Martin. It was 10 years ago, but I expect that most of you still remember that name. The church's lack of interest and concern bothered me, as I was married to a black man and working with dozens of vulnerable black teenagers. Stand your ground was apparently a biblical response, so Trayvon's death was justified. The color blindness mentality that I had grown up with suddenly did not make sense to me. And as I read my Bible, I could not find support for many of the stances that the church was taking. The white American church's complete and absolute alignment with the political ideology bothered me. I had grown up being told that these traditional values of meritocracy and color blindness were biblical and were to be conserved, and to question it meant I was questioning God or my faith. Within the American evangelical church, meritocracy reigns supreme. So if you are not doing well for yourself, you're obviously not working hard enough. I believe there's a proverb out there that supports that, apparently. It's like basically, since there's no color with color blindness, racism is not a valid reason for inequality. Joshua 1:9 has been my favorite verse since I can remember. It reads, "Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be terrified or discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go." There have been few things in my life that have required courage, as you can tell from my testimony. But the one thing that God has laid on my heart over and over is the courage to speak in truth and love about race. Being married to a black man and having 3 biracial children has necessitated it. And through the years, I have become more comfortable with making others uncomfortable by talking about racial justice. I know that in the church, specifically the white American church, talking about race is most often seen as divisive. I have been told by a very close family member that matters of race are not nearly as important as the real crises such as abortion or sex trafficking. And I'm sure that in many of you, the very mention of race has caused a negative, visceral reaction.
In 2018, shortly after we started coming here, I can remember approaching Pastor Tony. For the first time in my life, I can say that I didn't have that normal feeling of contentment. I was feeling broken. It had nothing to do with my home or work life, but rather my spiritual life. Karah and I were dedicating our lives to the church. We would always, as we always have, we would be here, and none of what we're saying is Crossway. We're talking about the church as a whole, but our church prior to this, we were just as dedicated. We were here every week, volunteering in different ways, leaders of life group, but I felt my spiritual life slipping. I had come to the conclusion that this country was not founded for the participation of black people and will never fully incorporate them into society. And I felt church had played and is playing a big part of the racial issues plaguing our nation. I can remember asking him, out of frustration, to tell me something good, tell me something the church has done in the last 50, 100, 250 years, something that the church itself had initiated. I remember asking questions like, if Billy Graham didn't do enough to end segregation, how is there any hope for anyone else? Who is leading our American church right now? And I remember thinking that my religion was never really mine, and only if I stayed in my lane would I be accepted. The church seemed to represent everything I was not. And I felt like it was trapping me in a corner to choose between my faith and my race. I remember telling him that I have to be unapologetically black because my race was not a choice, but my religion was. I understood the conflict this presented, but I was fed up. I was tired of having to defend blackness every time something in this country happened. Colin Kaepernick, police shootings, Black Lives Matter, and then George Floyd murder happened. I'm grateful when Pastor Tony gave us, 3 black men, the opportunity to share our experiences here on stage. I knew he would receive pushback for this gesture, and I know he knew that as well, but the fact that he was willing to give us the opportunity, even when it meant a few more empty seats on Sunday, that went a long way with me. But to be honest, I wasn't prepared to speak at that moment. I didn't show it, but inside I was mad. And I'm not saying watch it again, but I said that I wasn't mad. But inside I was mad. I didn't want to come off as the angry black man when I was speaking about that. I made a business decision. And if you look at that video, he asked, do I have anything else? I looked down at my sheet. I looked back and I said no, because I had a lot on my mind at that point.
I think it was that point that really acted as a catalyst for us to begin to make, especially me, make a concerted effort to read more and more about the Black historical and present-day experience in America. I think we can all admit that what we've learned in school regarding this is minimal at best. The information we gleaned from our reading furthered our desire to speak out about racial inequity when the opportunity presented itself. Nevertheless, despite what little you may have learned, I'm assuming that most of you are somewhat familiar with the origins of slavery in the United States. Our forefathers, self-identified Christians mostly, enslaved stolen African people and then used the Bible, our God-breathed scriptures, to defend it. If you're not familiar with the Curse of Ham, I encourage you to go look that up and read about that. That was actually apparently used at the university I attended from their beginning back in the early 1900s up until, I'd say, about 25 years ago, they stopped using it. Our founding documents as well supported this with the proclamation that Black enslaved people were to be counted as 3/5 of a person. Fast forward hundreds of years into the Jim Crow era, and white Christians would often leave the church after a Sunday morning service to bring their children, dressed in their Sunday best, to witness the lynching of Black men and women. Fast forward another decade or so, the 1950s, and we see desegregation starting. And then we see white families fleeing the public schools in fear of that desegregation, resulting in the formation of hundreds of Christian schools, some of which still exist today. This is our history as the white American church, and our complicity in racism is indisputable. However, we are still at the point where a majority of white Christians do not agree that the U.S. has a history of oppressing minorities. And though we claim to believe in the complete fallibility and the sin nature of man, the church is reluctant to accept that America's modern man-made systems could uphold racism. There are many statistics that support the findings of racial disparities in America, including disparities in healthcare, education, housing, generational wealth, criminal justice. For example, a Black woman is over 3 times more likely to die from pregnancy-related causes than a white woman. Think about that if it was yourself or your wife or your sister or your daughter that was more likely to die solely based on a physical characteristic, not a biological defect or an ailment, but solely because of cultural issues relating to the color of their skin. Would you be okay with that statistic? Would you be okay with that continuing? Would you throw up your hands and say, that's the way life goes, and move on? I have a lot of other statistics that I could name that also follow that trend. And something I found myself asking a lot of is, why are we okay with it happening to our black brothers and sisters? If we are Christ followers and value life, that very statistic should make us angry. But we, for some reason, have grown cold to the idea of racial inequality. We see talking about race as political and divisive and seemingly out of place with the gospel. We cringe at the idea of stating that Black lives matter as if that takes something away from our white lives. We turn a blind eye to racial injustice, quoting Romans, there is no distinction between Jew and Greek, while disregarding the hundreds of scripture passages that urge us to do justice and defend the oppressed. Psalm 89:14 says, righteousness and justice are the foundation of your throne. Love and faithfulness go before you. We have no problem embracing other social injustices with vigor and tenacity. For example, abortion. Abortion is a social injustice that we, the church, approach corporately. But when it comes to racial injustice, it is deemed a heart issue that should be dealt with individually. Righteousness and justice are foundational for our faith, and we have stopped pursuing them.
What does this all mean as we wrap up here? The most resounding necessity of the church, according to evangelical leaders, is our commitment to unity. I believe our country is in desperate need of unity, and I would think that most of you would agree. But I also confidently believe that we will never have unity within the church until we confront America's original sin head on. Unless we start telling the truth about our history, we'll never find a way to reconcile. As a nation, we have never apologized for that original sin. This is a deep moral failing compounded over the decades. And to this point, and this point is made even worse when you consider the fact that our nation has rightly apologized and, I'm not going to say the R word, but reimbursed those other wrong groups of fellow Americans. This made me angry when I realized this, but Japanese in internment camps, Native Americans. In 1860, over 10% of the U.S. population were slaves, close to 4 million people. And if any national bad deed deserves an apology, the scale of this atrocity demands it. That's our nation, and I believe Christians should embrace that, but what should Christians do? Author Justin Giboney offers us this: racial justice needs to become a priority. The Great Commandment tells us to love our neighbors as ourselves. 1 John 3:16 gives love a definition. It says, this is how we know what love is. Jesus Christ laid his life down for us. And it goes on to say that we should also lay down our lives for our brothers and sisters. Rhetorical question, I don't need to see hands raised, but how many of us in this room have sat down for a meal with a group of black people? A group, 3 or more. How many of you have had a conversation with a group of black people where you were the minority? And I can glean the answer to that, and maybe you have. Maybe you can answer in the affirmative. How many times, I would ask then next. And the only reason I say this is because how can we show love to people that we don't even know and we're right next to each other? Down the street is a black church. This is a predominantly white church, and we're just segregated on Sunday as the most segregated day of the week, as I believe Pastor Tony has said before. Biblical love is not simply a sentimental disposition or kind remarks or thoughts and prayers. Love in this instance is action. It's attending to the needs of others. Love is so sacrificial, majority Christians cannot remain comfortable.
Micah 6:8 says, he has told each of you what is good and what it is that the Lord requires of you, to act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. Acting justly requires that we identify and attack injustice. Loving mercy requires that we show compassion as God does for us, and walking humbly with God requires that we show deference for others, putting others before ourselves. When we choose comfortability over listening to our black brothers and sisters, we are choosing to put ourselves first. Galatians 6:2 commands us to bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. We have black brothers and sisters telling us that something is wrong, yet we ignore it or question it. When we choose to not listen, we are choosing self over others and missing an opportunity to show the love of Christ. We must possess humility and understanding that the way we have experienced the world is vastly different than the way others have experienced the world. Understanding this and developing empathy is a huge first step for forming relationships with others, especially across racial lines. I urge you to form relationships with people who do not look like you. I urge you to read books by Black authors or listen to their podcasts. There are a myriad of Black Christian authors who write regarding racial justice, and we would do very well to listen to them. As a church, I call for us to lament the racial tensions and injustice we see today. I invite you to read over Psalms 10 and 51, meditating on these words, mourning the pain and injustice that is in this world, and asking God for healing and reconciliation within the church and the world. This is something that we can do on our own, as well as alongside our brothers and sisters. Specifically, I was reading over Psalms 10 the other day, and thinking about the shooting in Buffalo. I'm assuming that all of you are aware of that. The guy who did it wrote a 180-page manifesto. He was a self-proclaimed white supremacist. And a lot of the information that he was using to write his manifesto was things that a lot of white Christians believe, which is heartbreaking. So I would encourage you to lament. I know there's obviously a whole book of Lamentations in the Bible about lamenting. So I would encourage you to do that, whether with other Christians or on your own. In closing, I'd like to read something Jamar Tisby said in his book, The Color of Compromise, and I would highly recommend that book. Historically speaking, when faced with the choice between racism and equality, the American church has tended to practice a complicit Christianity rather than a courageous Christianity. They chose comfort over constructive conflict, and in so doing, created and maintained a status quo of injustice. Complicit Christianity forfeits its moral authority by devaluing the image of God in people of color. Like a ship that has a cracked hull and is taking on water, Christianity has run aground on the rocks of racism and threatens to capsize. It has lost its integrity. By contrast, courageous Christianity embraces racial and ethnic diversity. It stands against any person, policy, or practice that would dim the glory of God reflected in the life of human beings from every tribe and tongue. My prayer for myself and for our church is that we will be willing to practice courageous Christianity. Sorry, guys.
And I'm going to go off script a little bit. I was thinking as I was coming up over here, and I wrote some stuff down on my phone, so just bear with me. But this is not easy for us to come up here and do this, and we appreciate you guys. We know this is a tough conversation to have, and we appreciate you guys giving us this opportunity. Many of you growing up may not have never learned about any of this stuff in school and realize that was a concerted effort. That was a concerted effort to adjust and the textbooks that you read growing up in school. But now the truth is starting to reach our children. And not a political speech, but, I'm not talking about the young ones. I'm talking about the ones in high school. And not just their textbooks or anything, but they have this information at their fingertips. And we're concerned about culture pulling them away. Well, I think we have to become concerned that we're pushing them away as well, because when they come across these truths and they realize that they've never been taught this in an institution that cares so much about them, I feel like that's pushing them away. I don't know why my mom stopped going to church, but I'm sure, and maybe I need to talk to her about this, I'm sure that something like this probably affected her in relationships or whatever you want to say. But I'm just thankful that, my grandma not forced us, but she introduced church to us, because where would I be without, I wouldn't be standing here today if I didn't have that. And I think about the testimonies that everybody has shared. They've all had one person, I'm not saying only one person, but they all shared one person that in their life that was influential, an uncle, a grandfather, somebody in their life that led them to Christ. And it just takes one person. And think about how many testimonies are out in the world, and not a testimony, but think about how many stories are out in the world where that one person is not in their life and they're still in the world and they don't know Christ because the one person didn't bring them truth. This, I realize, bear with me, but I have a hard time inviting black friends and families to church because I do not think that their life will get any better in church. And that's a reality. That's a reality of the country we live in today. And I realize that's on me. I get that part. But that's kind of where I am, is their life is not going to get any easier. Obviously, I'm limiting God, and that's something I have to work with on my, but we do want to invite people to church. But that's just a thought I have in my head, and, none of this is your fault. People sitting here, you guys weren't slave owners. You guys didn't, embrace this. But I'll say this. It's important to celebrate our victories as a country, and we do that all the time. We take credit, essentially, for those victories and the celebrations that we have. It's also important for us to lament our failures as a country. I'm going to end with this. I'll say that I'm in a different place than I was 4 years ago, not because that things have gotten better. They haven't, and sadly enough, they probably get worse if they even get better. I've always struggled with some of the notions this country was founded on simply because it was grounded in hypocrisy. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are beautiful things, and I wouldn't want to live in a country that didn't foster these rights. However, as believers, there are times that we are called to object these very noble rights, or at the very least be willing and ready to sacrifice them. Look no further than Jesus Christ as an example. Jesus came into our world in the flesh, lived among us, and gave up his right to life by surrendering his life on the cross for all, John 3:16. Philippians 2 tells us, he did not consider himself equal with God, and instead emptied himself by assuming the form of a servant, taking on likeness of all humanity. And when he had come as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, freely surrendering his liberties to the will of the Father. It's pretty safe to say he wasn't all that comfortable, yet he gave up his personal pursuit of happiness in favor of the greater good of God, the kingdom of God. I find solace in the fact that I follow a man who came into this world with nothing, in a land that didn't want him, surrounded by people who doubted him, only to die at the hands of his oppressor. My prayer is that the church will follow his example, ready and willing to sacrifice it all for the greater good of God, of the kingdom of God. Thank you.